Sessions, bringing together executives with a range of perspectives and experiences to talk business in Southeast Asia. Tonight, two icons of international business. Andrea Illy is chairman and CEO of Illy Coffee, a business founded by his grandfather in 1933. William P. Lauder is executive chairman of the Estee Lauder Group of Companies, which controls 30 brands with revenue of over $10 billion. Our guests have different philosophies about ideal business strategies in Asia, as they explained while on the way to our Singapore Sessions shoot in Chicago.
We're very comfortable being pioneers and being early into so many of the markets in this part of the world. We tend to have great success in this region, and our teams on the ground have a very deep understanding of what really motivates that consumer, which allows us to continue to be successful there.
We thoroughly select our partners before we start working with them. And then we start a very long-term relationship which might last for decades, usually forever.
While both these men know Asia well, they've come to different conclusions about how best to do business there. Andrea Illy believes his coffee speaks for itself and that customization for unique markets is a branding mistake. He famously said, "If you don't like our espresso, then drink our cappuccino." But that's about as far as I'll go in adapting to local taste. Even without catering to individual markets, Andrea has managed to achieve remarkable success, but it hasn't always been smooth sailing. So when you first started out in Asia, though, what was the biggest lesson that you learned?
We have to see Asia in two different places. Japan, we experienced a very difficult path in penetrating the market, the supply chain, because there are multi-layers of distribution in the Japanese supply chain, and every company is very specialized in what they do. In other countries, the most critical and important point has always been finding the local partner.
Asia is not overall a big coffee drinking society. Did you ever think, you know what, Asia's going to be kind of a small part of our business. It's never going to be a main focus.
I think it's certain that Asia will become one of the largest coffee consuming region in the world, because coffee consumption grows proportionally with the increase of disposable income. So you can already see Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, these countries which are very well-developed economy, the coffee consumption is much higher. So you can expect from mainland China to be the same.
Taste, though, is very difficult to change, right? I mean, in Asia and in many cultures, taste is so ingrained. So did you ever think of altering the taste of your coffees to adapt to Asian consumers?
The products that we offer is the same worldwide, because Illy ambition, Illy's mission is to do the best coffee in the world. So we perfected this unique blend over the decades, and then there are slight adaptation in terms of roasting degrees, in terms of grinding degrees. So you can have a longer coffee, a shorter coffee, one espresso, a ristretto, or a long, or a cappuccino, or even the filter coffee. So the adaptation is around the recipe, how it is prepared and served. But I don't see, we don't have any specific recipe for Asia.
Now, is there a market or markets in Asia that you'd like to be in that you're not in yet?
No, we are lucky to be everywhere, because the strategy of Illy is to be global. So Illy is present in 140 countries. So that means that in the Asian country, we are everywhere, even on top of the Himalayas. We would like to increase the penetration in some countries, like, for instance, Australia. I think we can do a better job. Mm-hmm. I think India will be something for the future. But the main places where we want to be, we are there. And now it's a question of nurturing the marketing and growing more.
What's the biggest change you've seen in the decade that you've been operating in Asia? The biggest change?
The biggest change that you can clearly feel is the cross-fertilization. It's not only happening in Asia, it's also happening in the Western world, because we definitely consume more Asian in the Western world, mm-hmm. more Asian food, more Asian design, more Asian culture altogether. And the opposite is true as well.
In terms of brand awareness, you know, now people know the brand Illy quite well, but in the beginning when you were starting out, how did you get consumers to recognize your brand.
Point of sale activation is the number one, let's say, vehicle for brand awareness, because you serve Illy in a nice cafe and you get signs and you get windows, you get the cups on the table, you get the package on the espresso machine, so this creates quite a good publicity. Point of sales and word of mouth are the two main ways to build the brand.
Illy is a luxury brand, it's a premium product, but in Asia, you have other coffee companies that have done very well. Starbucks, for instance, Nestle. Do you ever hope to challenge them?
Well, these are different companies. The first you mentioned is a retailer, so they operate their own shops, so this is their specialization. And the second one you mentioned is the biggest food company in the world, and of course also the biggest coffee maker in the world, owning maybe 25% of the coffee business.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a little bit inadequate from our part to challenge this kind of dimension, because we would need to compromise on our exclusivity.
Right. William Lauder has a different take on marketing and selling his brands in Asia. The son of the legendary Leonard A. Lauder and grandson of Estee Lauder herself, he's credited with expanding the company's international presence and strengthening its brand portfolio. His companies derive 21% of their sales from the Asia-Pacific region. They've been doing business there for decades, but they're constantly refining their approach. Tell us first about Estee Lauder's history in Asia and how it's changed, the marketplace, how it's changed since you first began there.
Well, you know, we've been in Asia for a long time, Betty, well over 40 years, and it's been one of the very best markets for us for growth. And it's really a good example, if you will, of how emerging markets go from being emerging to being very well-established markets. So back when we first entered in the late 60s, early 70s, Japan went from an emerging market to the second largest economy in the world and our second largest business in the world.
And William, biggest change you've seen in the last 40 years plus with Estee Lauder in Asia, biggest change?
Let's look at it from a country basis. That to me is the biggest change. You see, first you saw the rise of Japan, then came Korea, now you have China, as those three markets in the northern part of Asia are very influential from a consumer standpoint, very passionate consumers, very meaningful businesses. And now we see the Southeast Asian markets, the tigers, they're also very strong, but the populations aren't quite as big. What's next? Well, you see Vietnam emerging, and that's a very energetic, dynamic country. I imagine we're going to be talking about Myanmar in 10 years' time the way we're talking about Vietnam today. Vietnam in the future will be what Malaysia is today, and Malaysia will be like Korea. And I just see country after country emerging and evolving.
William, what's the biggest challenge operating in Asia?
Asia is a very well spread out market, and each market has a very different dynamic to it. And so there's no way you can say there's just one way of doing business in Asia. Even within China, doing business in the north of China or the eastern coastal cities, the more sophisticated, developed cities, is very different than the tier 2 and tier 3 cities.
Well, tell me what's been the easiest market to get into and what's been the hardest market to get into?
Probably the most complicated market to enter is China. A very highly regulated market, but obviously a very lucrative and attractive market. And the easier markets to enter would be markets like Hong Kong and Singapore, where the regulatory environment is a little less, but at the same time they're brutally competitive.
Do you think that you've done so well in Asia partly because you are a premium product and Asian consumers, particularly women, like to be more aspirational? They like their luxury products?
The Asian consumer is a very demanding consumer. When she finds something she likes, she really goes for it. And certainly our strength and our growth over the last, I don't know how many years, 10, 12, 15 years, has largely been driven by Asia because the Asian consumer is so passionate about what she loves.
What's been the biggest lesson for you that you've learned in Asia, I mean, through the years?
Well, you know, there's a number of things about the Asian consumer that we really love, that we really enjoy, and we find we have to continually refine what we do to do even better. First of all, the Asian consumer is very focused on treatment, creams, lotions, serums. And the Asian women have a very disciplined regimen about how they care for their skin, and they spend a great deal of time on it.
Coming up, we bring Andrea Illy and William Lauder together to discuss their divergent views on how Western companies can best compete in Asia.
The internet is growing very fast in Asia, and Google has expanded very quickly. We're seeing tremendous revenue growth and investment in Asia. We haven't had to do much to our products to make them very different, but what we have done is make sure that we have the right language support and also reflect the fact that the mobile revolution is even stronger than Asia than anywhere else.
All of Southeast Asia is pretty exciting. You know, obviously China, but lots of things happen in Indonesia, and a lot of the other countries, Taiwan and so forth.
Andrea Illy and William Lauder sell very different products. On the surface, coffee and cosmetics don't seem to have much in common, but the two leaders agree there are more similarities than you might think, as they told us when we all sat down together recently for this Singapore session. Andrea, let's start with you on what is the most important thing for you when you're building your brand in Asia?
Is to get the recognition of the quality of the taste. So we really speak to the nose of people. It's like selling a perfume. And because coffee is used to be, let's say, a commodity, and people were not used to distinguish the quality of the flavor. So this is why, in order to get this recognition, we have to educate the nose and the palate of the consumers. But before that, we need to educate the professionals of the hospitality for the preparation. So this is why education is #1 effort.
William, you don't actually have as much of that problem, right, with your products in terms of educating Asian consumers about what you're really about.
Well, you know, we always want to make sure our consumers understand more and more about what our brands are and how they use it. And I would say there's more similarity in beauty products and coffee than one might think on the surface, because it's part of a ritual.
A morning ritual.
It's a morning ritual, and in the sequence of the rituals.
Yeah, the similarities are centered around the aesthetical and experiential content.
Now, a lot of CEOs talk about how they want to be in Asia and they want to expand and grow in Asia, but it really isn't all that easy, right? I mean, you have all met your own challenges in that region. So, Andrea, tell me what's been one of the biggest challenges and what you learned from being in Asia.
Well, the biggest challenge is to the cultural adaptation, because there are different culture in anything, starting from the language, the values, the spirituality, and the taste. So we need to have the patience for the consumer to adapt and open himself to the Western experience.
Do you ever feel pressure to localize your products?
No localization, because there is no request about that. The request for this product is to get the authentic Italian experience. This is what everybody, also the non-Italian companies, try to imitate and try to deliver.
William, you mentioned earlier about one of your local lines that launched recently, Oshao, out of East Asia in Hong Kong. So did you do that reluctantly?
No, not at all. We actually were very enthusiastic about the concept of launching Oshao in Hong Kong, and it's really our first effort to create a brand from scratch, aimed at the Asian consumer, that has a very Asian sensibility, as opposed to most of our other brands which have a global sensibility.
Both of you have something in common, which is both of your last names are your brands, essentially. Your grandparents, both started your company. So what is the biggest question that you get when you're running your business, being that you're from a company where it's the legacy of your own family?
One of the things I've always felt very strongly about when you're in a family business and your name is on the door, first is the obligation to both lead those people who are part of your company in the right way, in the spirit of it, and understanding that by thought and by deed you carry the essence of what the brand stands for. But also, as a member of a family that in leading a company with your name on the door, you have to work twice as hard for half the credit.
Do you feel that way too?
Yeah, I agree very much. So we kind of embed the spirit of the founder. So when my grandfather Francesco founded the company, he had one dream, which was to serve the best coffee in the entire world. So we are still working for that dream. All the mission, the technology, and the market development is following this exact dream.
You know, I'm fascinated by what you said before, because you said my grandfather said bringing the best coffee in the world. Well, my grandmother said the same thing. She didn't say coffee, she said beauty product.
Yeah, and also the other aspect is the one you mentioned about the legacy in terms of knowledge. So I had to become a chemist myself to take over the position, because my grandfather's intuition was to send my father to study chemistry for doing better coffee. And as a matter of fact, it makes perfectly sense, because I can describe what's happening in the plant, in the bean, during the roasting process, during the conservation of the product in the packaging, and then during the extraction.
Well, it's fascinating. That's quite a commitment to the chemistry. Have you done any work in understanding the taste, what goes on in the palate of the consumer, and how she tastes
Yes,
it?
we do a lot. We do a lot in terms of taste, both on the physiological of taste, including understanding thoroughly whether there is a different genomics in the taste recognition in Asia, because we suspect that there is more super tasters, and the super tasters are people who are intolerable to bitterness more than others. And if there are more super tasters in Asia, this would be a problem, because for the bitterness of coffee.
You know, it's interesting you say you're looking at the difference between Asian consumers perhaps and Western consumers, because we've done some research also in that area, and we find that there are some distinct differences, somewhat physiological in the thickness of skin. But the other thing we found is also a very significant difference in the water.
Water is very important as well in coffee, particularly in the amount of minerals that you have inside, even though fortunately it doesn't affect too much the taste of the final product. But it's another point that we have in common,
right.
Water.
When we come back, our guests compare business models and outline what's next for their companies in Asia.
Well, I think the pace of the way things happen can sometimes be different. It's not only that you're relying on a different level of customer service, one that appeals to the culture of the Asian buyer, but you also need to be gentle when it comes to pacing. Nobody wants to be pushed or feel like they're being taken advantage of.
Both the commercial conditions and the distribution channels, as well as the sort of cultural norms and sensibilities, how people purchase, what they're interested in. I think it's important to have local partners that understand the culture and understand the commercial environment.
Welcome back to Singapore Sessions on Bloomberg Television. We've been speaking with William Lauder and Andrea Illy, and we asked them if they had questions for one another about how each has achieved such remarkable success in Asia.
Did you adapt your strategy in terms of business modeling, in terms of branding, in terms of route to market, in order to be able to penetrate the Asian markets to the same extent you were able so successfully to do in the Western countries?
Very much so, and this is an effort that goes back now more than 10 years or so, where what we had to recognize was that we needed to make a real commitment to investing in the emerging Asian markets. Most particularly, I use as the best example China. China is now the third largest market for us in the world, and it will soon be the second, and perhaps while I'm still alive, or maybe when my children are alive, it will become the largest market for us in the world. But in order to do that within our organization, we ring-fenced the investment in China, and we said, once you as a brand manager are committed to this, and once we are committed as a company, you can no longer pull and push monies in and out of China because of the strength of your business in other parts of the world. Because we wanted a consistent commitment to the investment in that marketplace. And at that moment, you know, when a brand manager says, well, you know, my business in Korea isn't as good as it needs, and I've got a little excess money in China, let me move it from China to Korea. We're like, no, you're not allowed. Stop. Today, the outgrowth of those sorts of internal management policies made a huge difference to us, and our Chinese market is so good because of a commitment, a consistent commitment for investment that was so important.
This is a typical advantage of family businesses, the long-term orientation. It's very interesting.
Absolutely correct. When we say we're a publicly traded company, but we're a family-controlled publicly traded company, and what we say to everybody is we think in generation and we think in decades. Long-term for us is 10 years.
Yeah.
Oftentimes the public markets, their definition of long-terms is 3 quarters. And we can't even get a product to market in 3 quarters, so to define that as long-term, when we're investing for a committed consumer over a long time. And that's where the payoff is.
I might copy you with this.
You're welcome to, anytime.
What's next for you? You're going to be hiring thousands of people, is that right, in Asia?
We're hiring thousands of people. Our business has grown tremendously. Just to give you an idea of the scope over a long term, 2004, 65% of the business, our global business, was done in North America. Today, 65 for almost 70% of our business is done outside of North America. And our business has grown from $5 billion to $10 billion. So we haven't stayed static and just shifted it, but in fact we've doubled the size of our business. The vast majority of that growth has come from Asia, from Europe, from Latin America, predominantly Asia, but the fact of the matter is now we've become a much more global company, and that's forced us to think global.
How about you?
We are in the process of more and more becoming a retailer. So because originally the business model of Illy Cafe has been selling to professionals or to the trade. But we recognize that because of the premiumness and the aesthetical and cultural content of our product, we know to go as close as possible to the consumer and develop a direct relationship with them. We do this through our own point of sales, both cafes and point of sales in department stores, as well as the e-commerce. So
you want to communicate directly to the
absolutely.
consumer.
This
That's
is what we are
goal.
doing. This is our main focus. In order to do that, you need to change completely the overall company, because you need to adapt all the product portfolio for the sake of being a retailer yourself. You need to hire completely different competences, make a dedicated investment. This is what we are doing.
Tell me about your experience in Singapore. When did you enter Singapore?
Well, Singapore is a very interesting city, state, where we do our own business in terms of selling coffee to the hotel, restaurants, consumers. We even have a cafe over there. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to settle down our organization for Asia in Singapore, because 2/3 of the coffee consumption in Asia are in the northern part of it. So we had to decide to go to Hong Kong, very much to my disappointment. So we will look forward. We are just waiting for the next occasion. We are partnered now with a Singapore airline with Illy Coffee on board, and we hope to do more. And what about you?
Well, you know, Singapore is really interesting. We started when it was one of the earliest markets that we entered in Asia, and we entered really the entire region with different distributorships in different countries, and over time we've bought them back and now operate themselves, and Singapore is one of them. We have a sub-regional headquarters in Singapore. We first started to create a regional headquarters in Singapore, but like you, we found there was so much business in the north of Asia, we needed to get a little closer with Hong Kong. But still, many of our regional functions remain in Singapore because they're very capable. They're very good, and there's no reason to move them to Hong Kong to keep doing what they do. But we're finding it's also becoming very interesting. For example, all of the markets that surround Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, we really manage all those businesses. It's really out of Singapore that we manage all those businesses. And it's it's a very competitive place in Singapore for us, because a lot of Indonesian consumers like to come to Singapore to shop. Now a lot more Chinese consumers are coming to Singapore to shop. It's like Hong Kong, a duty-free market, and so the consumer is expecting pricing to be different than their home markets, and we have to be mindful of a global pricing, the bands of global pricing. But the waves of consumers who come through, who travel there, is quite fascinating, and to see what they shop for in the airport, which is different from what they shop for in downtown, is also very interesting.
Yeah, I look forward to develop maybe the Australian and Indian coffee market, which are big anchor market, and coordinate them through Singapore, maybe in the years to come.
That's it for this edition of Singapore Sessions. Thank you to our guests for joining us, and thank you for watching. Please visit SingaporeSessions.com for some behind-the-scenes extras and to learn more about doing business in Southeast Asia. Join the conversation using #SingaporeSessions. You can also follow me on Twitter. Until next time, I'm Betty Liu. Goodbye.